Terry Johnson is a brilliant playwright who I think doesn't quite get the attention he deserves. Maybe because in some ways he's a bit of a misfit. He's a playwright, but as his wonderful recent play, Ken, recalls, his first proper involvement in theatre was as a member of the legendary experimental performance group led by Ken Campbell that created the 24-hour science fiction show The Warp at the Edinburgh Festival in 1979. He doesn't fit easily into any of the standard movements in British playwriting. He's not really a socialist writer or a feminist writer. He's not an in-your-face writer. His plays are political sometimes, but not in ways that particularly suited the moments they were in or the movements of playwriting that he was in. So he was writing, for example, on environmental issues before almost any playwright I can think of, in plays like Cries from the Mammal House from 1984 and Imagine Drowning from 1991. He's also fantastically funny, and his subject has often been comedy. I do think British theatre and British theatre critics in particular tend to be rather dismissive of comedy, suspecting that laughter is in some way an irresponsible evasion of responsibility, a second-rate kind of theatre, good in its way, but ultimately not to be trusted. And Terry Johnson has specialised in exploring the subversive riches and the dark emotional sources of comedy. So Hysteria from 1993 was a farce about a meeting between Sigmund Freud and Salvador Dali, in which the psychoanalytic, the surreal, and the comic come into extraordinary and stage-transforming collision. In a way, it's a farce about trying to understand farce. And this ushered in a series of plays in the 1990s that took comedy as their subject. So Dead Funny was set among suburban devotees of quite traditional English comedy, and it was set around those 2 days when Frankie Howerd died, and then the next day Benny Hill also died. And it reminds me in a certain way of Alan Ayckbourn's rather brilliant play from the 70s, Absent Friends, which is about a group of friends who gather to offer support and good cheer to one of their number who's just been shockingly bereaved. And it turns out that he's philosophically rather sanguine, while all the rest of them are rather more depressed and miserable than he is. In Terry Johnson's play Dead Funny, the one truly funny person is miserably surrounded by hopelessly unfunny people obsessed with comedy. Cleo, Camping, Emmanuel, and Dick is set on 4 sets of the 4 Carry On movies mentioned in the title. It focuses as well on the 3 stalwarts of that movie series, Sid James, Barbara Windsor, and Kenneth Williams. As with Dead Funny, though, the real topics are love, sex, and loneliness, the brilliant humour serving to bring out the misery behind the old jokes, and a desperate desire not to carry on. Terry later adapted and directed it for TV under the title Core Blimey, and you can find it on YouTube, and it's well worth your time. He also wrote another TV movie about Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, Not Only But Always, again trying to pick away at the scab of dissatisfaction and inadequacy behind great comedians. His tendency to put famous people in his plays as characters. Also, I wonder if that perhaps encourages people to think that plays share the insubstantiality of celebrity, when sometimes that is rather profoundly his subject. A recent play, Prism, from 2017, is about the great cinematographer Jack Cardiff, and it flirts with insubstantiality through a remarkable man whose memory is shot and his greatness as a filmmaker is vanishing theatrically into nothing. Perhaps his best-known play is Insignificance, which stages a meeting between Albert Einstein and Marilyn Monroe, the evanescent and the cosmic, in discussion about the theory of relativity. Hitchcock Blonde from 2003 takes us into the filming of Psycho and features Alfred Hitchcock himself. The images and the play is all about images, often being kind of out of reach. In Terry Johnson's original production, there's one stunning moment that I always remember, where an image of, I presume it was Janet Leigh, was projected onto the water of a shower. So it's light on water, which is a kind of choking image of the ungraspable object of desire for Hitchcock anyway. His book for the musical, Mrs. Henderson Presents, is about Laura Henderson, the founder of the Windmill Theatre in London, Soho, which specialised for many years in nude revue, which is cabaret performances displaying naked women posed completely still for the male clientele to ogle. And this mixture of real debates, real people rather, kind of brilliant intellectual debates about the unconscious, about relativity and so on, and comedy might lead us to think of him as a follower of Stoppard. But actually, while I do like some of Stoppard's plays, Johnson seems to be more serious in some ways, more somber under the comedy. There are some commitments to human emotion and pain that Stoppard rarely seems to touch. And what these descriptions also remind us, I think, is that Terry Johnson's real subject is probably sex. I've said that he's not a feminist, and he really isn't. He's interested quite obsessively in the darkness of male heterosexual desire. And he's not here to criticize, but to anatomize. It's there right through the work. His early play from 1984, Unsuitable for Adults, is about comedy again. And it's also one of the first plays to capture the emerging alternative comedy scene in some ways. But really, it's a play about the male gaze, male predatory behavior, the horror of desire and destruction going together. Hitchcock Blonde, which I've already mentioned, is about Hitchcock, but really it's about desperate, voyeuristic lust. In 2006, his play Pianoforte is a farce set in a country house, which was a very surprising thing to see at the Royal Court, but in which a Tory MP's wedding is derailed by sex, by secrets, and a Dionysian moment of phallic excess that you had to see to believe. Terry Johnson is unique and entirely unpredictable. My summary of a few of his favourite concerns doesn't really do justice to the richness and joy of his work, and I cannot wait to get a chance to talk to him.
Hey.
Hey, hello, how are you?
Yeah, I'm not bad. Nice to see you. I get myself centered on the mirror, I think. Definitely.
Right. You seem to have you got a green t-shirt on? Because it's creating a slightly psychedelic effect. That's very impressive. I didn't
that's because we rigged up a green screen last week to do a version of Ken on Zoom. And I've left my thing on, obviously. That's a lot easier to do the shirt up.
I like it.
Yeah. So and I went full green screen and added effects. It was it's not going to work, is it? It was very if I could remember how to do this, hold on. There'll be a way of getting rid of this. Choose virtual background. Let's have. You can have all sorts of virtual backgrounds, but let's choose none. Should be all right now.
Yes, your return to Earth. How are you finding lockdown otherwise?
Well, I feel I've been 2 weeks ahead of the curve. You know, I mean, I'm not a stupid person, so being as we're given information 2 weeks late, I was down here 2 weeks earlier than anybody else. Locking down, and it's been okay until this week. This week, my brain kind of turned into globules and floated off across the living room, really. But up until now, it's been fine. It's how I spend half my life. You know, I've been a semi-retired celibate since I was 50.
So Terry, what I'd really like to do, if this is kind of even possible to do, but is to talk in slightly more general terms about the ways you tend to write your plays. And then I think later on it'd be interesting to talk about a quite recent play, Prism, and just go into a bit more detail about how that kind of developed in your head. But just to kind of an obvious sort of place to start is to kind of think, where do your plays tend to begin? Do they tend to begin with a subject matter, a story, a real person, an incident, an image, a line of dialogue?
Yeah, there are always little small things, and if I knew where they came from, I'd visit more often. They need a few things in the crucible. A few things it's never one single thing, because a catalyst can't work like that. So it's usually two things. I've said this before, but for me, it's sometimes like a car crash, like a kid playing with cars, you know. I often say this to new writers. I rarely ask a new writer what's the idea you're working on. I ask, what are the 4 ideas you'd like to work on? Because if you look hard enough at your 4 ideas, you'll probably find that 2 of them might square off quite interestingly. And indeed, 2 of them might potentially be rather combative, you know? And if you did that wheelie thing and let those cars hit each other, you might be a lot further on to a complete play than you thought you were. So look for the car crash is something I'm always double checking. Am I stuck on an idea simply because it's not enough yet, and something needs to collide with it? And usually a good play comes out of such a collision for me. But I wish I knew how to. Inspiration is one thing, but inspiration that is red hot or white hot and actually forces you to sit down and create something is rather more difficult to find, really.
And I mean, one thing I think that it doesn't characterize by any means all of your plays, but certainly something that characterizes quite a lot of them is they represent real people. You know, whether that's kind of Hitchcock or Jack Cardiff or Einstein or, you know, those kind of people. I think what I'm interested in asking about this is that obviously those people have always been there kind of in your life or your cultural awareness or whatever. Can you say anything about what's the thing that turns them into just being, I am aware of the Carry On team, to going, I now think I can see how you make a play out of them? Do you see what I mean?
Well, it's usually some sort of juxtaposition or irony. In the case of the Carry On piece, it was learning that Sid and Barbara had an affair. That just seemed to me an iconic bit of folk history. And I mean, that's a great idea. Sid and Barbara had an affair during the Carry-Ons. I mean, you tremble at that idea. I wish I had one a week. You know, you tremble and you know you've committed the next 6 months of your life to pursuing that. So being as I've committed relatively few periods of 6 months of my life to writing plays, it's rare, but it happens. I wish it happened more often, but yeah, that seemed to me that was going to be an irony worth digging out. And then, of course, it's pure gold dust because those people come pre-packed with meaning. A real life comes pre-packed with meaning, and the author does not, the playwright does not have to imbue them with meaning in any way. It's kind of there. You're mining it out. It's, you know, you're mining it out.
Would it typically be a real discovery about people that is the kind of trigger for
Yeah,
thinking about the play?
Often, Marilyn Monroe had a signed photograph of Albert Einstein in her belongings when she died. It was found by Shelley Winters and hidden. And yeah, maybe I'm just attracted by illicit sexuality. Maybe that explains my entire career.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a lot of worse things to write about. But I suppose a question then would be, what do you then do? I mean, would you then kind of go, if I'm going to write about Einstein and Marilyn Monroe, I'm going to write about the Carry On Team or Jack Cardiff or Alfred Hitchcock or Freud and Dali or whatever it is, do you immediately go, right, I need to read some books?
Yeah. I mean, material is what you need. Everything's going to come from somewhere else. Hysteria was the biggest challenge. I think I had to, it was about the fourth time I'd read David Stafford Clark's book on Freud. It was about the fourth time I read it that I thought, oh, I can do this. I just kept starting it and giving up, starting it and giving up. So that play from Genesis to completion was 6-7 years, I think. You know, I just didn't feel qualified to deal with it until the time I picked up the book again and I flicked through it and I thought, I know this. Oh, I know that too. I understand what he's talking about. And like, but that was about the most literary piece I've ever done, I guess. I counted the books on the desk once. There were 17 books, open or marked and scribbled on. So that entire play, with the exception of the character of Jessica, who I did make up because I kind of had to, because Freud's case histories are rather specious. And nothing gave me what I needed, what I wanted, what I needed from that woman. So I made her up, but I would say everything in that play was in one of those books. It's a huge mishmash of fact, conjecture, and the brain power at that time, and the ambition to give it the time it needed, which was a lot of time.
And do you have, or what kind of responsibility do you feel towards the real people that you're writing about? I mean, I guess people who are alive, there is a libel. There are a set of libel considerations, but people, you know, like Dali and Freud, both dead when you wrote Hysteria. Do you still feel, but I want to tell the factual truth about them, or how do you feel you have liberties you can take?
Yeah, it's very hard to tell the factual truth about them because you know, lives do not a good play make. Jack Cardiff says in Prism, the problem is we live our lives in the wrong damn order. You know, they do not offer up a satisfactory story arc. Boy, is that true. So no, I don't mind taking liberties. I take huge liberty. But I don't think, I can't recall a character that I feel I have dishonored. Sid James' family would disagree with me quite vociferously, but I don't feel I've dishonored any particular characters. But you do get into interesting situations. I got hold of Barbara Windsor's number because I thought, well, I can't write this without her in the middle of it. And I thought it might be contentious. So before I wasted time, I connected with her. And she went, oh, yeah, go on, love, go ahead. And I went, obviously, I'll let you read it before it's finished. She said, oh, no, darling, I don't want to read it. I said, no, really, you're going to read it before. And yeah, she was very sweet about it. And in fact, I sent it to her, and a few days later, well, weeks later, it was a bit of a fearful time. I got this very quiet voiced Barbara on the end of the phone. She said, hello, darling, it's Barbara. I've read your play. I thought, oh, God. And then she went, how did you know?
Oh, really?
And yeah, so spooky moment of, how did you know? I said, well, a lot of it's written there. She said, no, I'm not talking about that. She said, who'd you been talking to?
Really?
Nobody. I don't know anybody. I know you. She went, how did you know about the pillow? And it got really spooky, you know. So that was a nice thumbs up. I thought, well, yeah, we're all the same schmuck, aren't we? You know.
And and with your, you know, you're doing research obviously for these things. What kind of notes are you taking? I mean, is it that you're assembling a kind of chronology of facts, or are you writing down images that occur to you, or is it generating bits of dialogue, or what?
Yeah, you just scribble on the books. You go, oh yeah, that's in. That's not. That's in. Can I get that in? What would that turn into? Yeah. It's just like being in a sweet shop. When I did the Peter Cook, it was great. I'd never had a script supervisor before. I'd never had a researcher, and then I sent him all the books, and he was kind of brilliant. I can't remember his name. He was a young chap who was interning in company TV office, and he turned it into a history, and he had cross references, and I could go by year, person. I mean, it was fantastic. He wrote a Bible, which I've never done. It's always been more scattery than me. But it's a mosaic. It's a. You've got to throw everything in and then see what survives, haven't you? You know.
What would you say is the kind of, because obviously the method you're describing, I could imagine that could be how you might write a factual book about the Carry On team or
Yeah.
whatever, but clearly there's a playwright's brain that's working through this. I mean, can you say anything about what you think is distinctive about what Terry Johnson gets from this book that somebody else who isn't a playwright or isn't you as a playwright wouldn't necessarily get?
Well, we haven't talked about what any of these pieces are about, and you know, they're not about Monroe, and they're not about Peter Cook ultimately. Otherwise, they'd be kind of dull. I think that what we've described so far is how you write Act One.
Right.
And I think the technical demands and the dramatic demands of Act Two, because I've often facetiously said to new writers, you can do anything in Act One as long as it's either funny or sexy or interesting, vaguely. Do anything you like. Act Two, you've got to earn your fucking feathers. And somewhere in structuring the tale of Act Two, obviously what you want to say will inform that. But I never know what I'm really wanting to say. And if I do, it probably the writing isn't going to complete.
That's interesting. Does that mean that is it that when you're writing a play, you're aware that this story about these real people is generating other thoughts and other ideas, the way that, you know, I think Prism is on one level also talking about what is a life and what does it mean to capture a life in some way, but you don't necessarily focus on that. You just go, I can trust I've found a story that will discuss that, will generate thoughts about that.
That's exactly, well, it's more complex, but that is kind of how it happens. I mean, yeah, Prism became about facing the final chapter and one's own frailties and fears and what have you, which wasn't difficult at all. Especially as Bob and I were arriving at roughly the same chapter at roughly the same time. It was, yeah, became quite poignant. There was a moment I had to ring up Mason Cardiff, and no, he rang me and said, how's it going? I went, well, it's going very well. I love your dad and I love the world. I'm having a little bit of trouble finding a present time plot. And he said, "Oh, that could be a problem." I said, "It is a problem because I have no second act. I don't know what this is about." He said, "Oh, are there any solutions?" I went, "Well, would you mind if I made you a bit of a cunt?" And there was a pause, and Mason went, "Oh, I don't see why not." So there was the seed of a dynamic there about how you deal with Dad. And actually, Mason, having invented the project, was demoted to man who couldn't deal with it in order to make a play. So that's a good example. And here's to Mason for taking it on the chin, you know.
Yeah.
That family was extraordinary because half of Prism is fiction and half is true. And the family have been very embracing of it in both its guises. Yeah.
And so let's say that there's obviously a period of the process, which is you're reading the books and you're generating story ideas, and it's building up in your head that, oh, this is actually potentially about something another thing that you're going to trust to. Would it be I'm trying to think, when the point when you're actually writing the play, does that happen kind of in one go at the end, or are you kind of writing it bit by bit right the way through the period, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, there's no that's never settled down into any particular process. I'd say it happened simultaneously. I suppose on a television commission, it kind of happens more simultaneously because, you know, the carrot is juicy and one's kind of racing for the line. Other things, I've never developed a writing technique because the thing is, unlike some, I'm not a writer. I don't see myself as primarily a writer. All I've ever done is put plays on, and some of them I've written down first, and some of the more complex things I've done are thus the things I've written myself. But that's not false modesty. It's just a fact. I've written to put plays on, and it's not a process I like. I find I have no excitement. Quite the contrary. I mean, Stephen King talks about the joy of the clean white page, and I just want to shoot him. For me, it's a horror. The clean white page is a horror. And yeah.
The thing that I suppose surprises me about that, and I think would surprise a lot of people, is of course that what your plays, you've written a lot of comedies, or at least, I mean, you've written plays about comedy, but you've also written plays that are very, very funny. And it feels like that would have to be a certain joy in the writing, or is it just a very technical exercise? How do I make this funny?
I'm not saying that there isn't a moment when you break through and you know you're on a winner, as it were, or you know that. So I'm not saying the entire process is joyless, but you know, some writers really, really do like sitting down to start, sitting down to begin, sitting down. No, I just want to race to the end, really. I want to stumble to the end. There is a glorious time when you've written a draft or two drafts and suddenly you can see where the play is good and where you merely presumed the play was good. And there's a glorious time when you know you're on the home straight, you're back in the stadium and you've got all to play for, and they can't do it for 6 months anyway. And that's lovely. That's lovely because you can just play with, you know, tinkering and fixing, but you know the car works, and you know you're going to get all the way with it. So there are happier times. They're not all misery, but yeah, gestation is, well, look, I haven't written an awful lot compared to some, so that shows you how hard I find gestation, not completion. You know.
I mean, you described, I mean, maybe I'm putting words into your mouth, but sort of picking out a bit from what you said, it sounds like there is a sort of, you kind of blunder through a first draft to get to the end, but then you find, in a sense, there's a slightly more pleasurable and more controlled process, which is the rewriting, redrafting, reconstructing period.
Yeah, and that can be really rich because you're talking to yourself then, and your characters are talking to you, and they're talking to each other, and you know, there's nothing nicer than, okay, let's do a draft and really deepen Barbara. Let's find Barbara's emotional points as well as her witty points, you know. And it comes as soon as you think you've finished, you've sorted out the second act structure, which you haven't, because it'll fall apart on you in a few weeks' time. But when you think you have, then you feel good for a while.
And I'm thinking about structure before you, let's say you write this kind of quite quick first draft. Well, you didn't say quick actually, but this first draft, what do you know about the kind of shape of what you're going to do, and what don't you know?
The last thing you learn as a playwright, I believe, is second act structure, because I think, you know, unless you're lucky enough to be taught by Stephen Jeffries, mostly who taught backwards, really. You know, he taught a little about how you generate the beginnings of plays and how you get your ideas going. But, you know, Stephen was much more interested in how you in the basket you carry it in as well, you know. And so the last thing most writers learn is second act structure, and the last thing to settle in a play is second act structure. There are some exceptions. Carol Churchill is an exception. I once asked her when she stumbled on the Top Girls structure, and she said, well, I always knew it was going to be there. I went, really? Because it's a third structure, and brilliant, and, you know, content dictates form in a perfect way. So I was truly surprised to learn that she knew what the form was before she even started writing that, which is fascinating. But not me. But I'm fairly sure of it. If someone I don't have great faith in, some stranger comes up to me and goes, oh, I've written a play, will you read it? I used to be very generous and very embracing of all such people, even in pubs or theatre bars. But I'm more cautious now, so I tend to say, no, I won't read your play, but I'll tell you what's wrong with it. And I've had quite a hit rate of success by talking in great detail about their second act structure. And I've had them nodding sagely, going, well, how did you know? How did you know that? Yeah, so it's easy teaching.
Does that mean that you write your first draft in order to kind of sort of scope the thing out a bit, sort of case the joint a bit, and then you look at it and go, what do I have here? This could be organized in such a way that would give me my second act structure? Or do you have a sense of that shape before you write your first draft?
The problem here is there's a presumption in the question, Dan, and the presumption is that there's any sort of methodology that has been formulated at any point in the work, in my work, and it simply hasn't.
Right.
You get better at it. You get quicker at it. You spot things from further off. You know, when something rushes by, you go, whoa, no, you're going over there. You know, if you gave me 17 marked books today, I could put them roughly in the order of where that information ought to be spilt quite quickly. So you learn, but the process is a mess, and always is a mess for me, and a distressing mess, which is why, as I say, I chose very consciously to direct theatre rather than write theatre, because I didn't want to become Peter Nichols. I didn't want that level of angst and anger and ultimately that huge sense of rejection he felt for the last 2 decades of his life, you know. And I thought, that's the kind of writer I am, if that's what I do.
Right.
So my whole career has been a delaying tactic, really, and it's an excuse to get out of the house. But it doesn't help describe playwriting. I'm aware of that. Yeah. Content and form.
When you have in the process got to a point where you feel like I could write now, and I kind of have to write, and I must stop procrastinating, and I need to write a draft. At that point, are you relatively disciplined? Do you kind of go, and I write for a certain number of hours a day and get to the end quite quickly, or is it still a bit sort of pick it up here, try a bit there?
I can be really fast, and there is certainly a period of huge discipline. Because if I don't sit down at the desk at the beginning of the day, I won't. So,
right,
you know, that's changed over the years. My first few plays were written between the hours of midnight and 7 a.m. I couldn't do that now and wouldn't want to do that now. So my writing kind of happens at 11 or 10:30. And now I'm done by 1 o'clock, really. I don't have the mental facility to push through the day anymore. But I guess I'm relatively disciplined because I'm relatively anal. That's the reason, I guess. But it's a terrible, it's a very difficult thing to do. And so if I don't write for 2 days, and I'm supposed to be writing, I've said to myself, I'm writing, that's what you're writing, and 2 days go by and you haven't done any, then I'm no longer surprised. But for many, many years, I was always unaware as to why I'd become deeply depressed. And it came to me in a gentle revelation that because you're writing, one day, which just went to prove that I was right, you know, 2 decades earlier, to treat it very carefully. And writers, as we know, are drinkers and depressives, and that's simply because we're not writing when we feel we should be, ought to be, or even want to be. I detest the phrase writer's block because it presupposes there is something to be blocked. And that's not the problem. The problem is there is nothing. There is nothing to be blocked. It does not exist because the job is inventing it. And so it's a much more insidious problem, writer's block. Writer's block feels like you've just kind of got a punchy, it's a boxing metaphor, isn't it? It's just, and it's not accurate. If I'm very depressed, it still takes me 2 days of being very depressed to realize the reason I'm very depressed is because I was writing, wasn't I? And I'm not. So, you know, it's very mad brain stuff. Very mad brain stuff.
And you kind of said you think of yourself as somebody who puts on shows, and sometimes you have to write the plays.
Yeah.
Does it kind of work the other way, in that sense that when you're writing a play, are you kind of already anticipating directing it?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's why I do my own stuff now, for better or worse. There was a key moment when I'd finished Hysteria. You do get oiled, right? So Hysteria oiled me, and I went straight on to Dead Funny, and they were written in the same year. Well, Hysteria was the bulk of Hysteria, the completion of Hysteria, and Dead Funny was written in the same year, one off the back of the other. And I kind of knew that I couldn't direct Hysteria because I didn't have enough confidence in it, or it was too complicated. And I knew absolutely I would direct Dead Funny. And since that hinge moment, I've directed everything, as I say, for better or worse, that I've done. Because by that time I thought, no, it's up to me to complete the play anyway. So, you know, you will get it completed. Funnily enough, I've just written something that's sitting on the Hampstead desk, which might be the first thing I don't direct for quite a few years. I haven't even told them that yet. But yeah, there's something about it. It's a bit too unwieldy. I think I might just prefer to stay home. I'm getting old, Dan.
That's really interesting to me, the reference to Hysteria, because I think one of the I mean, I love that play, but one of the things that is completely wonderful about it is what happens at the very end, which, you know, where basically the world kind of splits apart and it becomes a kind of Dali painting and a dream and those sorts of things. And I kind of wonder whether there was a bit of you. I think some playwrights would kind of go, I fuck knows how they're going to do that, but I'm going to write it anyway and see what happens. But then there's the end of the first half of Prism, in which something slightly similar kind of happens, that we've moved from a garage, contemporary garage, and suddenly we're in the African Queen. But in Prism, you presumably knew you were going to direct it or thought you would direct it, so you must have had some sense that you're not writing a kind of, there's not a bit of chutzpah where you're just going, and now over to you, you're going, this is going to be my problem. See what I mean? So
I've got the skills now to solve whatever I write. Yeah.
Right.
But the Hysteria thing was mad. I mean, that's been rewritten a dozen times because, yeah, I finally got it right, I think, or felt that I'd made it publishable the last time I did it, which was with Tony Sher. But yeah, the thing didn't have to make sense. So the first time I did more or less leave it to Phillida. And then I think I sat down and wrote what she'd written, what she'd devised from what I'd written. Okay. And then I've rewritten it for people that can't afford people and people that can't afford scenery. And I usually try and communicate that it doesn't really matter what happens in that passage as long as the audience never forget it.
A couple of very nuts and bolts questions. When you write a play, are you handwriting or typing, computer, or what?
I'm typing. I'm on Final Draft or I'm on Word. But then usually, almost always, I'll print off a draft and I'll work on pencil on the draft, and then I'll go back to the computer. Mm-hmm. I wrote very few things on a typewriter, but I did write things on a typewriter. Mm-hmm. It was a different method of typing, a different method of writing. I mean, weird when you think about it. Mm. And now I don't have 17 books open either. I just Google any question, you know.
Yeah, of course.
So it's changed the very nature of writing. But yeah, on the whole, it's a formal type based on those years when you were on a carbon and you reread every sentence before you wrote the next word. I mean, Christ, it was slow. I mean, your fingers literally bled.
Yeah.
So you can get a bit too lackadaisical with computers. So what I tend to do is make myself print. That does two things. One is you have a hard copy, which you can put on the shelf and is actually a freedom device because it will never disappear. And the other is that it also gives you something to scribble on, and scribbling is quite good. So it usually goes, yeah, scribble, type, scribble, type, scribble, type.
Really, really nuts and bolts questions. When you are typing in Word a play, what's your font?
The font is chosen for the play.
Okay. Okay. So do you want to give me an example?
Well, I suppose my go-to font is Arial Narrow because it's very clear.
Okay.
That's the font. That's my default font, if you like.
Right.
But I'm embarrassed to admit that the Carry On piece was written in Comic Sans. And yeah, no, usually. The Ken was written in two fonts, one for myself and one for Ken. And myself was American Typewriter.
Okay.
And Ken was Comic Sans Bold.
Thank you. These are the important questions. And then
Absolutely, bloody right. I mean, let's start at the beginning and get your fonts right.
I mentioned comedy before, which obviously is a subject matter of a lot of your plays, but also it's the mode of your plays. You've written farces. You've written quite a few farces, and you've written. In fact, I don't know that you've written many plays that aren't very funny. What I'm going to ask a really, really banal question here. How do you write funny? Is it okay? Is it just about trusting that you will think of funny things to say as you're writing dialogue, or is it, or are you kind of going, actually, I can see that this is a comic structure for this scene, or there's a set of events that are going to be in themselves funny?
Well, look, if you decide to write Salvador Dali, you know it can be quite funny. You only have to watch him for 10 minutes and you go, that's quite funny. Because there's going to be an eccentricity there. If you look at the great sitcoms, and the great double acts, you've got a guy who's stupid and a guy who thinks he's not stupid and is therefore more stupid than stupid. These tropes are very easy to I think I've just got them in my blood somehow, those tropes. Who was it said, I think it was Jimmy Perry, said you can't write a sitcom without sarcasm. You've got to find who's your sarcastic character and what degrees of sarcasm can you achieve. And it is true, you have a fool and you have someone who's sarcastic. And in terms of finding when it is quite odd because I'm not funny in real life. I really struggle to, in a room of people, to be anything near the witty one. I mean, far more, well, I'm the silent one most of the time. And I certainly feel an enormous pressure, especially with those terribly funny men who kind of entrance women because they laugh so much. I hate them men. I can't do it. And I really can't do it. I do have to go home and think up the joke. I have written passages with bracket, joke, bracket in early drafts,
Right.
Because something's funny's got to be said, but you don't know what it is yet. I don't know. It's when I'm in a flow. It is odd, and I do go, "Oh, that's very funny." I know when it's funny, but I don't know quite where it comes from. I often run, I suppose, just thinking out loud really, like you and I are talking and you ask me a question and I give an answer, and you ask me another question and I give an answer. Well, possibly if I was playwriting it, I would just think just for a beat, and I would listen to the answer that is the natural answer. And I would go, but could I just, how could I make that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So you'd go, yeah. So instead of going, well, Dan, it's a philosophical question, you'd go, well, Dan, you've got a few books behind you. So you riff before you write, maybe. I think I've noticed myself doing that a bit. But it's great when you come up with a really good one.
Mm.
But they can be hard fought for.
And can I just kind of quickly talk about, I mean, I've focused a bit on the plays of yours that are based on real and famous people, but there are plays of yours that aren't. And I'm thinking that I think probably the first play of yours that I saw kind of actually live on a stage rather than just read it or something was Imagine Drowning, the Hampstead Theatre, which was probably nearly 30 years ago. And from memory, I didn't reread it for this, but from memory, that's an original story, isn't it?
It is. It's got Buzz Aldrin in it. but he is for some reason on a northern beach. So
yeah,
I don't think that particularly counts.
I mean, that must be a slightly different process because you haven't got 17 books. You can, well, I mean, I suppose you can.
No, and but I've done less than that because I find that part very hard, and it's not a successful play. I mean, I was trying to shove together enough stuff to make drama with, and heavens, there was enough there, but it's not a good play. Michael Waring wanted to make it into a 3-part telly at some point. Well, when Michael Waring had the wherewithal, and it would have been, if you think of it in terms of a kind of not so long form nowadays, it would probably stand up. It'd probably be quite interesting. Mm. But then it's too dense and it didn't really know what it was doing.
It also, it does fit. I think it's the first play I can think of that was also trying to do something environmental. It's sort of,
yeah.
I think it's a really interesting thing. And in some ways, for me, at that time, I thought of it, and it's interesting you mentioned Michael Waring, because I thought of it in terms of kind of Edge of Darkness. It had that mixture of environmental thriller, mystery thing. But, as I say, I haven't reread it.
Mm. I've never revisited it, really. Right. I think nobody ever asks to do it, so there's no reason. But no, it wasn't a huge. Yeah, I don't regard it as a work worth reinvestigating.
Okay, Prism. I have my prop here. Where did that start?
It started in a pub with Mason Cardiff, son of Jack, and Robert Lindsay. They're all part of the aristocracy the film aristocracy down in Denham. And they just wanted to do something about Jack. And Tom Stoppard turned them down, which was Bob's opening line to me in a lunch, which then cost him a lot of money. I just thought, because I've been flirting with Bob for decades, really, and we'd never come up with anything. So it was not my window. The window was opened. And I don't know, it was the the sexual attraction about working, so that's the wrong sentence. I was going to say it was a sexual attraction about working with Robert Lindsay. Let me rephrase that. It was a sexy proposition to get Bob to do a major play. And yeah, and so that was a plus. That was an energizer. Hampstead had some good commissioning money. That was an energizer. Mason was a really open, interesting chap. And the garage, man, the garage is there.
Right.
I mean, how can you walk out of that garage and not write a play in it? We just had Marilyn's hat on.
So you, I mean, okay, so in a sense, there's a project that's kind of being brought to you, but I mean, how developed is it? Or are they just saying, they were just saying, Jack Cardiff is really interesting, surely.
Well, they handed me Jack's book, his autobiography, which is, as autobiographies go, it's very cautious. It's not, there's no ambition to reveal himself in any way. It's just, it's amusing. It's musings and anecdotes, if you like. And it's very nice, but there's nothing essentially in there to make a play with. What was the process? I don't know. Present time plot was a problem. I still think it's a little bit thin. Will Jack write a book or not? It's thin. But I was handed key things like the relationship between Jack and his carer, the carer who taught them how to, a different psychological ploy to go along with Jack's confusions rather than challenge them, which is a trusted technique now, but for them, they didn't know it. No one had shared it with them, and one of Jack's carers shared it with them. She was a bit of a goth, which I tried for a long time, and goth wasn't doing it for me, so I just went emo. And so there were burning things that Mason wanted to see in there, most of which are there, but there were a few things missing. And you know, Jack's whole elaborately romantic past, because he was a charmer. It was how to express that, really. So most of the fiction in the play comes with the backstory, if you like, the Jack and the romance between Jack and Catherine. The woman is transposed. That's not the love of his life. It was another actor. So there's a transposition there. I don't know why. I do know why, because of this book. There was a transposition occurred because I found this.
Okay.
Which, for those of you that haven't read it, you can get it for £3.50, and man, it's so beautiful. And look, it's full of the most extraordinary photographs. And she writes like a dream. Really? It's a beautiful book. And shame on anyone who hasn't read it. £5 on Amazon. Highly recommended. And so, yeah, I loved that book, and I loved her voice. And I don't know, so I thought, well, okay, it's not going to be actress A, it's going to be Catherine. And this whole thing about him confusing people and that love triangle, that's the biggest cheek of the play, if you like, because that's the piece that makes it universal for some reason. I think it's the thing people relate most to as a metaphor for their own regrets and dissatisfactions with life partners and what have you. So yeah. And then I guess there's a lot of me in it, but you know.
Yeah.
I
mean, do you remember thinking? I mean, maybe it's the book that you've just shown me. I mean, it does this thing that I described before at the end of Act 1, where we slip into his memories or his illusion, whatever it is. I mean, that feels like the moment where you thought that could happen feels to me like that would have really unlocked the writing of the play a bit. Do you remember how that thought occurred?
Again, it was around looking into the making of his film. Right. And the film I just kept beckoning was The African Queen, which is not his best work. I mean, it's actually rather slightly pedestrianly lit, right, because he made the mistake of lighting the jungle as well as he would have lit anything. Right. When in fact, it was just before people realized that the best thing about going to the jungle is to do it handheld and fall over and not mind about the shadows. So in a way, the extraordinary work he does on African Queen, you don't notice because he's just doing the impossible thing of lighting in a jungle, you know? But that was the one that just kept appealing as the backstory, as the place to go. I always know we'd go somewhere.
And you mentioned, I think, quite early in this discussion that you said something to the effect of half the play is made up and half of it's kind of real. Yeah. Is it the Catherine Hepburn story that's made up?
Fundamentally, yeah.
Then I suppose one thing I think it's really interesting to think about is, I guess with a play like this and with a lot of plays that you've written, there's going to be a sort of balance between saying there's all this real stuff around that some people in the audience will know a lot about. So people will know a lot about that period of Hollywood, and so they will get a lot of jokes, if you see what I mean. And some people won't perhaps ever have heard of Jack Cardiff, but they want to see Robert Lindsay on a stage. Do you kind of worry at all, think at all about the fact there are sort of two kinds of relationship to the material?
No, I can't really worry about that.
Right.
No, I don't. And I've never worried about making stuff up at the same time as doing stuff that was biographical. It's never concerned me. I mean, it concerned me more with, writing about Peter Cook. I felt I should try and keep it pretty accurate.
Right.
And I don't know, sometimes you feel like that. I felt it with Barbara, obviously. And other times you go, oh, what the hell? It's a play. Their real lives existed, sure, but that's not what I'm writing about. I'm using people's knowledge of them as a starting point for a bunch of characters, rather than writing a biography. I don't think I mean, Peter Cook is probably the closest I've written to a biography, isn't it?
Right.
And it was pretty wild, to be honest.
The
most damning thing was a very polite Ian Hislop, who I met at dinner, who obviously hated it, but was not it wasn't in a panel show mood at dinner, and was very charming, chose to be very charming. And he said, you only got one major thing wrong. And I said, what? He said, Peter was funny.
Oh, really?
I thought, I'm going to take that on the chin. But it's a fair comment. But the reason it's a fair comment is that when you're writing a drama, that's the other thing that goes west. If you're going to ask me where the missing 12 minutes of not only but always are, well, they were never written because you're focusing on a drama and conflict, and what you're not doing is going down the pub with Peter,
Right.
or having lunch upstairs in the Coach and Horses with Peter. At which point he would be incredibly funny and incredibly charming for hours on end, none of which even made it to a final draft, let alone a final cut. So his lot was perfectly entitled to go, well, that's what was missing. Well, yeah, it was. And if the thing had been 3 hours long, there'd have been a lot more happy Peter being very funny.
I suppose when I asked the kind of question about the relationship between the audience that know the stories and the audience who don't, it's just occurred to me there's a great joke in it, in Prism, where I think it's where they're talking about Robert Bolt, and they
Yes.
kind of say, you know, if you lovely, but if you go to their house and his wife offers you a Chardonnay, don't accept it. And
Yeah.
he says, why not? He says, doesn't matter, or something like that, which I guess is a joke about Sarah Miles drinking her own urine.
It didn't exactly bring the house down, but it would elicit great guffaws from row D 36 and 37.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we debated many times as to whether the gag was worth the guffaws. But yeah, we couldn't bring ourselves to remove it because there was always somebody who appreciated us at that point.
Okay. Last question, and you, given your pain at writing, you might find this a particularly awful question, but you've been writing for 40 years. What have you learned? What do you think you can do now that you couldn't do when you were writing Cries from the Mammal House or Unsuitable for Adults or something?
Well, I can waste less time and I can work faster. I can waste less time on things which I deep down don't think is going to make it, and I can do everything a bit faster, I suppose. I don't know. You, at some point along the line to become a playwright, you have to stop concentrating on what the piece is about and decide where it's set and who's in it. And if you've got where it's set and who's in it, and you leave, well, you know, we've all sat through interminable theatre pieces that are about something. And as soon as we glean what it's about, we're either onside, offside, or bored. And, you know, so if you can bash that to the back of your consciousness, it will take care of itself. Find who's in it, and find what's happening, and find where it is, and find what's funny about that, and what's tragic about that. And what it's about will take care of itself. I've learned that. So I'm just trying to put a few people in a room and see what happens. It's really quite weird. Good luck out there. But you know, yeah, I've got a horrible feeling that yeah, semi-retired celibate.
Well, I'm very excited to hear there's a new play on Hamster's desk. That's something to look forward to. But in the meantime, enjoy the rest of lockdown. Thank you so much for your generosity and your time.
No, that's all right. All right. Well, good luck with the younger and hungrier.
Thank you so much. Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Dan. Actually, I've taken up a hobby. Okay, this is the hobby. I've decided I want to do conjuring. So, and I'm particularly into like pack tricks.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that's good. The only trouble is I can't show them to anybody because no pack trick is good from 6 feet.